is Ukrainian Radio. In this half-hour broadcast of Radio Ukraine International, you will hear the news bulletin, Ukrainian Perspective, a program of news reports and commentaries, and our regular feature, Reading Lounge, presenting literary works by famous Ukrainian writers and poets.
First, the news read by Serhiy Melisny. The situation in Donetsk is described as extremely tense by the city authorities. Artillery fire and explosions have been heard throughout the day, especially in the central districts of the city. Earlier on Wednesday, a shell hit a bus stop in Donetsk, killing 6 to 8 people, according to different media reports. Most of the victims were standing at the bus stop when the shell exploded, and some were in the bus, which burned down. As reported, intense fighting is ongoing near the Donetsk airport, held by the government troops, and the nearby Kievsky and Kubashevsky districts of the city are also under fire. Ukrainian armed forces reported Wednesday that the strategic site of the Donetsk airport was controlled by Ukrainian units, which have been lately reinforced with armaments and manpower. The Army Operation Press Center said that Ukrainian servicemen are also controlling the situation around the southeastern seaport of Mariupol. An artillery fire hit the ground 5 meters away from a school in Donetsk, killing 4 adults. 8 more were injured. Over 200 people were in the school at the moment, including 70 children and 28 teachers. The children were immediately sent to the shelters. According to preliminary data, no pupils were injured, said the city council. A team of technical workers repairing high-voltage power line near the village of Semenivka in the Donetsk region came under a sudden rocket attack which killed one of the workers. The rest of the brigade have not been injured, their company said in a statement on Tuesday. The National Security and Defense Council reported on Wednesday noon that 5 Ukrainian servicemen were wounded in the past 24 hours in eastern Ukraine. No fatalities were reported. Overall, in almost a month since the ceasefire between the Ukrainian side and the pro-Russian separatists, the latter have attacked Ukrainian troops over 1,000 times, according to the Security and Defense Council. Representatives of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe continue working in Luhansk region, OSCE Special Monitoring Mission spokesman Michael Baturkiev told a press conference. Monitors are still working both in Luhansk and the region. It is obvious from the reports posted daily on OSCE website. But since the humanitarian situation in Luhansk and adjacent areas is very complex and some OSCE monitors are not fully protected, the number of members in our mission has slightly changed, Baturkiev said. The mission strictly adheres to its mandate, which involves establishing and reporting facts and establishing a dialogue where possible, he said. There are still hundreds of Russian troops, including special forces, in Ukraine, NATO spokesman Jay Jansen has said, according to Deutsche Welle. He said that there had been a significant forced withdrawal since Kiev and pro-Russian rebels agreed a ceasefire. However, hundreds of Russian troops, including special forces, still remain inside Ukraine, Jansen said. In addition, according to NATO, some 20,000 Russian soldiers were still deployed near the Ukrainian border. The European Union has informed Ukraine about the completion of its internal procedures regarding the implementation of the association agreement, and now this is part of the Ukrainian legislation, according to a statement posted on the official page of Ukraine's President Petro Poroshenko in a social network on Tuesday evening. Thus, both Kyiv and Brussels have completed all formalities for the agreement to be launched from as early as the 1st of November, said Poroshenko's statement. EU Commissioner-designate for European Neighbourhood Policy and Enlargement Negotiations, Johannes Hahn, has said that most Ukrainians have a clear desire to become a part of the European Union. But on the other hand, he stressed that the country is still far away from this. In view of this, Hahn said that was a rather realistic approach by President Poroshenko to propose that in next 5 to 6 years until 2020, there are 50-60 necessary reforms that might be a baseline for a future application of the EU standards in Ukraine. And that's all the news for this hour. I am Serhiy Melisny.
This is Radio Ukraine International with Ukrainian Perspective, a program of news, reports, and commentaries. I'm Larissa Nizova, and the studio producer is Ludmila Sudakova. In the past 24 hours, 5 Ukrainian servicemen have been wounded in the east of Ukraine, where the anti-terrorist operation is being conducted. Information to this effect was disclosed by Andriy Lysenko, spokesperson for the National Security and Defense Council, at a briefing on Wednesday, October 1st in Kyiv. Rebels fired at a school and a public minibus in the city of Donetsk. 10 residents were killed and 9 injured. On the whole, the situation in the zone of the anti-terrorist operation remains very tense. In violation of the ceasefire agreements, rebels are shelling positions of the Ukrainian army as well as villages and towns. Besides, the morale in the illegal military formations is low. Rebels become increasingly belligerent, and clashes, including armed ones among them, are frequent, says Andriy Lysenko, spokesman for the National Security and Defense Council.
Найбільш напружена ситуація спостерігається в районах Донецького аеропорту, також міст Маріуполь, Дебальцеве, Щастя.
Hostilities run especially high around Donetsk airport, as well as the cities of Mariupol, Debaltseve, and Shastya. In the past 24 hours, the airport and these cities have been regularly shelled by Grad missile launchers, mortars, and other portable guns. Terrorists are redeploying tanks and armored vehicles near the city of Debaltseve, said Andriy Lysenko. Russian troops are still present at the Ukrainian border. Speaking at a news briefing in Kyiv on Wednesday, spokesman Andriy Lysenko had this to say.
НАТО Джей Янсен заявив, що на території України досі перебувають сотні російських військових.
NATO official Jen Jansen informs that hundreds of Russian military are still in Ukrainian territory, including special task teams. Thus, according to data provided by NATO, almost 20,000 soldiers of the Russian armed forces are currently stationed at the Russian side of the border, said Andriy Lysenko. Ukraine cooperates closely with the mission of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe in order to ensure the effective monitoring of the ceasefire in the east of this country. By the end of this week, the mission's offices in Luhansk and Donetsk will be enlarged by 25 new members. Soon, Austria will provide several pilotless vehicles for the mission to conduct effective air observation of the territory of the conflict. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian government supervises the evacuation of the teaching staff and facilities of the universities and colleges from the temporarily occupied cities in the east. Reporting to the cabinet meeting on Wednesday, Education Minister Serhiy Kvit said that the best higher-level education institutions, including the Financial University of Luhansk, had been removed from the city to safer places in the Donetsk region. At the present time, 8 universities operate in the places controlled by the Ukrainian authorities in Donetsk region and 2 universities in Luhansk region. You are tuned to Radio Ukraine International, and we continue our news program, Ukrainian Perspective. The Central Election Commission has finished the registration of candidates nominated for the pre-term parliamentary election scheduled for October 26th. In all, the Commission has registered 3,500 candidates to a new Verkhovna Rada. Almost two-thirds of them are self-nominated, and the rest run on party tickets. The election will be held all over Ukraine, as it is stipulated by election legislation. Central Election Commission head Mikhailo Okhendovsky says that the parliamentary election this year will be held amid the military aggression against Ukraine. It is for the first time in history of modern Ukraine. Okhendovsky has nevertheless assured that any attempt to disrupt the election will be futile. Voters of Donetsk and Luhansk regions can also come to ballot stations and cast their votes. Okhendovsky is sure that the election situation will be better than that at the presidential election this May, when voting was held only at 8 election districts in Donetsk and 2 in Luhansk regions. Now we will be able to organize the election at more election districts, Okhendovsky said. The following is his comment.
Вже зараз ми можемо говорити про можливість проведення голосування в 11 щонайменше округах Донецької області і щонайменше в 4 округах Луганської області.
Already today we can speak about a possibility of conducting voting at least at 11 election districts in Donetsk and 4 in Luhansk regions. Of course, we will do our best so that the voting process will be held all over the regions. We will see to it that the maximum safe conditions will be created for voters as well as members of local election commissions, reporters and observers, said Mikhailo Okhendovsky. The Central Election Commission, together with the Interior Ministry, the Defense Ministry and the Security Service, has drafted a security plan of actions that takes into account the present-day challenges. Okhendovsky said that the Commission would work in a close contact with the law enforcement agencies to make sure that the election will be held in accordance with Ukrainian legislation and international standards. You're listening to Ukrainian Perspective, a program of news, reports, and commentaries. The city of Ivano-Frankivsk in western Ukraine hosted the presentation ceremony of the album titled The Taras Well, dedicated to the 200th birth anniversary of Taras Shevchenko, a brilliant poet, painter, and playwright of the 19th century. The album contains 270 choral and a cappella works, popular songs performed to bandura accompaniment, as well as recitals of Shevchenko's poems. The best academic choirs, individual singers and actors, as well as youth bands perform works based on the verses written by the great Shevchenko. The idea of gathering all these works and releasing them as one compact disc belongs to merited artist of Ukraine, Lubomir Nikorak, the conductor of the Ivano-Frankivsk Orchestra of Folk Instruments called Rhapsody, says Lubomir Nikorak.
Ідеєю створення цього диску, щоб можна було відібрати максимальну кількість пісень.
We wanted to select as many songs to Shevchenko's verses and poems as possible, the songs that are performed by the best artists, and then distribute the CD among cultural and educational institutions to popularize the literary legacy of Taras Shevchenko, said Lubomir Nikorak. The presentation of the album The Taras Well was held as a part of the project dubbed Choose Ukrainian that was launched 7 years ago. Over these years, the project organizers have been able to collect more than 18,000 Ukrainian songs, 70 films, and countless poems, verses, fairy tales, and lullabies. Igor Havrinchuk is one of the initiators and compilers of the album. Speaking at the presentation ceremony, he said that Ukrainian must occupy the prominent place in this society. And that was the news program Ukrainian Perspective, presented by Larissa Nizova and produced by Ludmila Sudakova. welcome to Radio Ukraine International and its Reading Lounge. Today we continue reading St. John's Eve, a story by Mykola Hohol. Fedorka was neither dead nor alive. At first, it was horrible to her to remain alone in the cottage, but in course of time, the poor woman grew accustomed to her sorrow. But it was impossible to recognize the Fedorka of former days. No blush, no smile. She was thin and worn with grief and had wept her bright eyes away. Once, someone who evidently took pity on her advised her to go to the witch who dwelt in the Bers ravine and enjoyed the reputation of being able to cure every disease in the world. She determined to try this last remedy. Word by word, she persuaded the old woman to come to her. This was St. John's Eve as a chance. Petro lay insensible on the bench and didn't observe the newcomer. Little by little he rose and looked about him. Suddenly he trembled in every limb as though he were on the scaffold. His hair rose upon his head and he laughed such a laugh as pierced Fedorka's heart with fear. "I have remembered, he cried in terrible joy, and swinging a hatchet round his head, he flung it at the old woman with all his might. The hatchet penetrated the oaken door 7 inches. The old woman disappeared, and a child of 7 in a white blouse with covered head stood in the middle of the cottage. The sheet flew off. "Ivash!" cried Fedorka and ran to him, but the apparition became covered from head to foot with blood and illumined the whole room with red light. She ran into the passage in her terror, but recovering herself a little, wished to help him. In vain. The door had slammed behind her so securely that she could not open it. People ran up and began to knock. They broke in the door as though there was but one mind about them. The whole cottage was full of smoke, and just in the middle, where Petrus had stood, was a heap of ashes, from which smoke was still rising. They flung themselves upon the steps. Only broken potsherds lay there instead of ducats. The Cossacks stood with staring eyes and open mouths, not daring to move a hair, as if rooted to the earth. Such terror did this wonder inspire in them. I do not remember what happened next. Fedorka took a vow to go upon a pilgrimage, collected the property left her by her father, and in a few days it was as if she had never been in the village. Whither she had gone, no one could tell. Officious old women would have dispatched her to the same place whither Petro had gone. But a Cossack from Kiev reported that he had seen in a cloister a nun withered to a mere skeleton who prayed unceasingly, and her fellow villagers recognized her as Fedorka by all the signs. That no one had ever heard her utter a word, that she had come on foot and had brought a frame for the icon of God's Mother, set with such brilliant stones that all were dazzled at the sight. But this was not the end, if you please. On the same day that the evil one made way with Petrus, Busavuk appeared again, but all fled from him. They knew what sort of a bird he was, none else than Satan, who had assumed human form in order to unearth treasures. And since treasures do not yield to unclean hands, he seduced the young. That same year, all deserted their earth huts and collected in a village. But even there was no peace on account of that accursed Busavuk. My late grandfather's aunt said that he was particularly angry with her because she had abandoned her former tavern and tried with all his might to revenge himself upon her. Once, the village elders were assembled in the tavern and, as the saying goes, were arranging the proceedings at the table, in the middle of which was placed a small roasted lamb. Shame to say. They chattered about this, that, and the other, among the rest about various marvels and strange things. Well, they saw something. It would have been nothing if only one had seen it, but all saw it, and it was this. The sheep raised his head, his goggling eyes became alive and sparkled, and the black, bristling moustache, which appeared for one instant, made a significant gesture at those present. All at once recognized Buster Rook's countenance in the sheep's head. My grandfather's aunt thought it was on the point of asking her for vodka. The worthy elders seized their hats and hastened home. Another time, the church elder himself, who was fond of an occasional private interview with my grandfather's brandy glass, had not succeeded in getting to the bottom twice, when he beheld the glass bowing very low to him. Satan take you, let us make the sign of the cross over you. And the same marvel happened to his better half. She had just begun to mix the dough in a huge kneading trough when suddenly the trough sprang up. Stop, stop, where are you going? Putting its arms akimbo with dignity, it went skipping all about the cottage. You may laugh, but it was not laughing matter to our grandfathers. And in vain did Father Afanasi go through all the village with holy water and chase the devil to all the streets with his brush. And my late grandfather's aunt long complained that as soon as it was dark, someone came knocking at her door and scratching at the wall. Well, all appears to be quiet now in the place where our village stands. But it was not so very long ago, my father was still alive, that I remember how a good man could not pass the ruined tavern, which a dishonest race had long managed for their own interest. From the smoke-blackened chimneys, smoke poured out in a pillar and rising high in the air as if to take an observation, rolled off like a cat, scattering burning coals over the steppe. And Satan, the son of a dog should not be mentioned, sobbed so pitifully in her lair that the startled ravens rose in flocks from the neighboring oak wood and flew through the air with Wild Cries. You've just heard the short story St. John's Eve by Nikolai Gogol. And now my colleague Serhiy Melishny will tell you about the literary work of Ivan Franko.
The son of an illiterate village blacksmith, Ivan Franko became a wise teacher of his people and an accomplished man of letters. He was born in a plain peasant hut in a remote Galician village. Renamed after him, this village is now known far beyond the borders of his native Ukraine. Picking up the thread of Ukrainian literature where the immortal Shevchenko left off, Franko embraced with his sharp vision and ardent heart all of the Ukraine, which was then being torn apart by two tyrannical empires, Russia and Austro-Hungary. Above all else, he loved his people, sharing both their anguish and aspirations, and firmly believing that eventually they would gain a place in the community of free nations. For him, patriotism was inseparable from love of other peoples. He identified with all who shed their sweat and blood and all whom fetters oppress. Drawing vitality and strength from his native soil, Ivan Franko, a true patriot and internationalist, emerged as one of the most outstanding revolutionary democratic writers to contribute his remarkably rich and diverse legacy to world culture. The Constitution for Pigs. The story is not my spiritual property. I heard it in Zbaraj in eastern Galicia from an old peasant, Anton Hrycuniak by name, who told it at a public meeting. Hrycuniak is a very interesting phenomenon, one of the few living remnants of that tribe of storytellers and banderist minstrels who composed old dumy about the exploits and adventures of the Cossacks, Hrycko-Zborovsky, Kishka, Bezrydny and Andiba, about the battles waged by Khmelnytsky against the Poles, and about the tragic escape of the three brothers from Azov, and chanted them to the Cossack troops, who were all ears. His outer appearance in no way is out of the ordinary. He's a common oldster, dressed not finely and even poorly, not very tall, his face furrowed from labor but full of expression, his black eyes bright. He stands out in no way in a crowd of peasants. He injects himself rarely into the conversation, and at first glance does not show any higher order of intelligence than the ordinary level of the Galician peasant. Naturally, he can neither read nor write. A few minutes before the meeting opened, I was talking with several peasants I knew. Hrycuniak came up and we were introduced, exchanged a few words, and parted. My acquaintances, mainly young farmers who had finished grammar school and by dint of keen reading had increased their education, could not praise Hrycuniak highly enough to me for his remarkable oratorical powers, and also because he was one of the few people of the older generation who had joined the
Radio Miami International, Okeechobee, Florida, USA, and www.wrmi.net. Send us your comments and reception reports to info@wrmi.net or by regular mail to WRMI, Post Office Box 526-852, Miami, Florida 33152, USA.
5053. Remember, we'd like to hear from you. Your letter of support, your call, your contributions is what helps us to maintain